Hey everyone, welcome to this Snack and Learn webinar titled Climate Gentrification. What is it, how to assess it, and what to do about it? Before Catherine and I kick this off, just some housekeeping items. This webinar is a little bit longer than some of the other Snack and Learn, so the presentation will be around 30 minutes and we'll have 10 to 15 minutes for a Q&A at the end. You're welcome to put questions in the questions box in the chat feature. And then the handout box will have the presentation available for you all. So with that, we'll get started. So my name is Allie Reilly. I work on the U.S. Climate Resilience team. I'm based in California on the traditional land of the Ohlone. I work primarily for public agencies across the country to help them understand climate risk through a social equity lens.
Good morning, everybody, or good evening. My name is Catherine Prince. I work with Allie in our climate resilience team. I lead our Florida practice here. My role is to assist agencies enhance quality of life for current and future generations with people-centered solutions. To me, that means to achieve an elevated climate resilience solutions for the long term. I tend to focus more on the engineering and infrastructure implementation side and supporting policies. I am based in South Florida and the land of the Seminoles. I look forward to having this discussion with you today. Thank you, Allie.
Yeah, thanks, Catherine. Great, so today we're going to start with an overview of climate displacement, migration, and gentrification to give some context and discuss some of the trends that we're seeing globally, as well as in the project context, and also just generally provide some background on equity in the US so that you all understand kind of the way that we approach this project. Then we'll dig into the Jackson Street Corridor project and give some overview of the project objectives, how we completed the analysis, and the outcomes and recommendations of the gentrification analysis that we completed. And then we'll reflect on what this work means for our work here in the US and the work that we do, but also just more broadly about being practitioners in the planning and engineering space. So starting off with kind of the trends overview and contextualizing the work that we did in Jackson Street. So climate change, which many of you might be seeing in the places that you live across the globe, is leading to displacement and migration already. So it's spurring the movement of people across the globe in two primary ways. One is through displacement, which is the forced relocation of people due to climate-related events. And it's estimated that 21.5 million people have been displaced annually due to weather events since 2008. So it's a huge population of people moving across the globe, and that, you know, it's important to consider in our work. And then climate migration is considered the somewhat voluntary movement of people. So folks recognizing that where they live might be too risky due to climate change and opting to live elsewhere. So we definitely welcome you to put in the chat kind of what you're seeing in your area of the world, and if you're seeing any of these trends play out. And so we just wanted to start with a kind of overview of what gentrification is. So it's a process of change within historically disinvested communities or neighborhoods, really largely due to investments. So you're going to see kind of real estate investments, higher income residents moving in, and as a result, seeing demographic changes. So the graphic on the right is really kind of demonstrating how these processes move over time. So, you know, the drivers being investments, primary impacts, and secondary impacts. And really, you know, the important part of this is thinking about who's most vulnerable to gentrification. You know, we're seeing folks, you can see in the bottom graphic, you know, some of the folks that we see in the US context who are more likely to be at risk of gentrification and vulnerable to these changes. And so the piece that we want to zero in on is thinking about how climate change is also becoming a driver of gentrification. It is also perpetuating these changes by increasing property values, making certain areas more valuable than others. And, you know, those secondary impacts are still true in terms of, you know, changing community character as well as potential displacement of existing residents. So on the left, you'll see the definition of climate gentrification, which was coined by Jesse Keenan, a professor at Tulane, in his 2018 paper. And so, we see this as something that is happening in a lot of places. It is not, it's agnostic of climate hazard. It could be applied and thought through in the context of fires, high heat, as well as flooding and coastal change. And so before I pass it off to Catherine to talk through kind of the US equity context piece, we just wanted to set this organizing framework. We felt this is really helpful as our work as practitioners, but also just for this presentation to show you kind of the different threads that we pulled into our work. And so we are really thinking about our work from this context of how do we address historic inequities, the past, and prepare for changing climate conditions, the future, and what do we do about it today? So, we're going to talk about a context or a project that we worked on very recently and how we try to merge these two lenses together. And I'll pass it off to Catherine.
Thank you, Allie. So we understand that our policies in the past are creating impacts today. So the approach we are taking is when we look at planning for the future corridor development or any infrastructure, we want to look at what is happening today and ensure that the unintended outcomes are curtailed to the extent we possibly can. So let's take a step back and look at some of the history in the US. So there were structural policies called, one of them, redlining policy in the US in the 1980s, 1920s, 1930s, where certain sections of the community were disinvested, mostly because of lending practices. So banks would not lend to communities within areas called redlined. And these areas were predominantly where people of color immigrant populations lived. And over time, some of these so-called redline areas were also categorized as industrial areas, for those familiar with the zoning terms, which means it's not residential. There's also a mix of industrial uses. So because of the zoning changes from redlining coastal zoning changes, these areas were prime for interstate and roadway construction improvements. So in the 1950s and the 1960s, several of these so-called redline areas were bulldozed to create these infrastructure projects. So next slide, let's take a look at an example in Miami. So Miami is in Florida, in southeast part of Florida. Next slide, we are a large community, about 2.7 million people. And here's an example of Overtown. As you can see, it is right outside of our downtown Miami area. In the early 1920s, this was a hub for cultural activity for immigrants, predominantly African American from the Bahamas, the islands very close to us. And it was a thriving community from entertainment districts. There are some existing saved historic areas, theaters, beautiful theaters, but it was a thriving community. Next slide. But it was designated as a colored town and then zoned as industrial in the 1960s. What that resulted in was a construction of the Interstate 95, which connects north-south of Florida and through the US. And a large number of people were displaced, pretty much breaking up the community. And what that has resulted in today, right? 50 years ago, the decision was made to create these highways through the neighborhood. Today, we see that this community, it has not sprung back. In fact, it has gone the opposite. There's a severe poverty and other impacts. It has, the interstate still continues to be a barrier between the two sides of the community. Next slide. WSP assisted recently with Miami-Dade County to assess crashes. So we looked at crashes on the roadways, and what we saw was certain areas were disproportionately impacted. There were some clusters of areas which had a lot higher number of crashes, both vehicle and vehicle crashes, as well as vehicle and people, so people walking and biking crashes, and it's disproportionate compared to the rest of the country. So we, instead of just coming up with recommendations, we wanted to understand why this is happening in certain areas and not in others. Intuitively, one would think these areas which have higher number of people, higher density of people, would have more of these incidents, but it was happening away from the downtown. Next slide. So we did some root cause analysis just to see what is happening, what could be those other challenges. We saw a high correlation with socioeconomic factors and higher number of low-income households, and in fact homes with households with zero cars. And they also happen to be predominantly African American and Hispanic communities, so our Black and Brown communities were disproportionately impacted. It's pretty sobering that these communities bear the impact of past decisions. So there is a very distinct connection between past practices and policies that we are feeling the impact today. So very clearly our decisions and how we plan and design our roadway infrastructure has clear impacts to the adjacent community. Next slide. And we're going to look at another community just for which is right next to Overtown. It is away from the downtown, a couple of miles away from the downtown. It's called Overtown. Similar context. It is a predominantly African American community, has a high number of lower income population. We are seeing a different trend today. Another trend in this area wherein people are being displaced, and the reason is folks, the higher income, wealthier waterfront properties are, in the last decade especially, are seeing higher coastal risk from seasonal high tides, from hurricanes, which are becoming more frequent. So what we're seeing is where the wealthier communities are choosing to invest in these higher grounds away from the water, which also happen to be where you have these lower income communities, which are now displacing these lower income communities and putting financial stress, where these folks have lived there for generations, no longer have a place to live. So this trend we are seeing in other parts of the state as well. So how does this translate when we plan and design infrastructure and our roadways? We want to share with you a case study, next slide, of Jackson Street, which is a corridor-wide project. Next slide. So again, WSP was brought on to help do a vision plan for Jackson Street. Now this is located on the northwest of Florida, but the context is similar, where Florida still has a very high coastal risk from climate change. So the corridor itself is on an elevated location compared to the lower lying waterfront community. So the task at hand, what we were brought on to do is a master plan for the 6-mile corridor. And within the 6-mile corridor, there are 3 different agencies that oversee and have jurisdiction, and we'll go through that really quick in the coming slides. And our end product, our goal, was to present the community with a unified long-term master plan with engineering cost estimates and identifying grant funding sources, which means basically we are trying to create a roadway which can be built in the coming years. Next slide. The context, as I mentioned, so there are multiple agencies. So the 3 agencies that oversee the 6-mile corridor. You can see the 3 different colors, blue, yellow, and gray. So the easternmost side is within the city of Pensacola. And the brown lines you see around are the community redevelopment agencies, which focus on investment within that section, within those boundaries. And then to the west side, the yellow and the gray is county, Escambia County. Next slide. As I mentioned, the intent or the task that WSP was given was to come up with this community vision and a roadmap for implementation. And we also helped identify funding to make this come alive. And how do we get there? We came up with the vision plan, next slide, through extensive community engagement. And you'll see the context of the community in a little while, but this was from the very beginning through the development of this vision plan. There was constant outreach to the community. Now, this was right after we were coming out of the COVID, and you will see the masks. But we did 2 things. We went to the community to where people interacted with. So grocery stores, we were there. So the pop-ups, you see that. We also had workshops. We had people come in and engage with us at workshops. Next slide. Here's an example of one of the ways we engaged when we brought people to us. We asked what they would like to see as far as mobility and safety improvements. We also asked what they would like to see as far as within the community, which is, would you want to have aging in place solutions beyond the roadway improvements, right? So even though our task was to design within the right of way or the area that the city and county owns, we want to look at larger impacts beyond the right of way. So we asked that of the community. Next slide. So a bit more context on the corridor itself. On the east side of the corridor, you'll see that it is a predominantly African American community, and very similar context to what we spoke on earlier, right outside the downtown city of Pensacola. And the far west end of the corridor is a mix of all communities. And what you do not see in these dots is there's also a heavy Asian population, again, immigrant population on the west side. Next slide. Very clearly, you will see that the east side of the corridor has lesser income, lower incomes, annual income compared to the west end of the corridor. And I'm going to pass this on to Allie, but I just want to say as I mentioned, this corridor sits at a higher level. So you can see that we did look at future impacts of climate change. All the yellow lines are the higher elevation. The blue green lines are the lower elevation. Also, you can see the risk from hurricane is in the blue area. So this is one of the reasons we had to look at what are the future impacts. So I'll pass it on to Allie to elaborate more on that.
Yeah, thanks, Catherine. Yeah, so like Catherine said, this is the current conditions. So these show, storm surge for today's conditions based on historical events. And so, like Catherine said, we recognized a concern based on where Jackson Street sits in relation to the other areas surrounding it, that there might be a concern for climate gentrification and seeing folks move from the more coastal, low-lying areas to higher elevations. And so we, like the example Catherine shared, saw a lot of similarities in terms of demographics, and also saw this concern for higher elevation and wanted to dig into it as part of this study. And so we conducted a climate gentrification analysis, which also, included not only climate change as a driver, but also investment. So also thinking about what we were planning on the project itself. And it was really meant to be a preliminary analysis, looking at, climate and housing market trends. And so some ways that we saw this analysis being able to be used by the county, the CRA, the city was to inform long-term planning on the corridor. So, thinking about if there's this concern for not only investments leading to potential displacement, what can we do to also mitigate in respect to climate change? So those recommendations, could be around rent control, affordable housing, and other measures. We also wanted to kind of provide this context as a way for the region to think about how they might mitigate climate risk over time. So, what would their priorities be and how would they weave this into a broader climate strategy? And then, largely trying to think of ways to reduce the movement of high-risk people to higher climate-related risk areas. So, maybe there's this concern that if folks are displaced, that they're going to end up in more risky locations, and maybe that consideration needs to be brought into a climate plan as well. And also just to identify recommendations for broader future climate risk study for the region. The very high level. So this graphic looks very similar to the one we showed early on around gentrification and kind of the drivers, primary impacts and secondary impacts. So basically, we really elaborated on this to kind of be our working model and theory of how climate gentrification and investment gentrification could play out on the corridor. So specifically in this context, there's a concern for climate change risk like sea level rise, precipitation changes, hurricanes, like Catherine mentioned. And so you could see folks moving in from the coast to Jackson Street, seeing it as a desirable location, and even people along the corridor moving to higher elevations within that corridor. And then, this is kind of related to this idea of climate migration. There's definitely opportunity for displacement here as well, but kind of this voluntary relocation to less risky locations, like the corridor itself. And then, this leading to impacts and disruptions to property values in those less risky locations. And obviously, this is all, also amidst a backdrop of redevelopment, reinvestment pressures along the corridor itself. And so the outcomes of this that we were thinking through and trying to assess were, the financial stress on existing residents, how to mitigate that, and then possible displacement of current residents, as well as financial stress and community change. This is really our theory of change and kind of how we dug into this study. And so here's a quick overview of our analysis methodology. And so I just want to start by saying that there's no existing methodology for this work. This is the first time our team has completed this work, and it's a new kind of area of thinking in the field. So we had to develop our own methodology, and also that meant that we needed to rely on existing data sources for the project. So, there's definitely areas of improvement that we can use in a future analysis. But essentially, we developed a hypothesis of factors that may impact displacement of vulnerable communities. So you'll see that at the top of this table, we considered climate change. Like I mentioned, we thought largely about coastal risk, and also kind of thought about heat and how that could play into it at a certain level in terms of shade availability on the corridor and what that meant. We also thought about social and economic vulnerability. We thought about the policy context, what are the existing policies that might lead to displacement, or the ability for an entity to evict folks who are living in housing on the corridor already. And then we also did a market analysis looking at market trends. And so to assess each of these categories, we identified risk factors that may increase the vulnerability of gentrification and displacement. So you'll see those in the second row of this table, thinking about race and ethnicity, much like Catherine mentioned, median household income, zero vehicle households, median income, poverty levels, and socio-demographic change. Like we talked about the policies. And then for market, we thought about housing market values and rent measures in the region. And so we did an analysis of all of these different risk factors through GIS mapping, using largely US Census data and housing marking data. And then we looked through our analysis to identify trends. So for the market piece, we really thought about kind of change in median property value, median gross rent as a percentage of income. And on the kind of population demographic piece, we thought about the shift in minority populations over time, the shift in median income, and shift in poverty. So these are the really high level findings from the analysis. So effectively, going back to what Catherine was sharing, this might not be hugely surprising, but we really recognize an area of risk on the eastern part of the corridor, which you can see here. Um, in this area of the corridor, based on our analysis, we saw that rents are up, incomes are up, and the percentage of minority residents is down. And so we thought about what this could be due to in terms of what is the motivation, the cause. So this could be due to natural demographic changes, new renters paying more than long-term residents, and new wealthier non-minority residents moving in, potentially leading to displacement. And we recognize that climate change may exacerbate these existing trends. And we wanted to think through kind of how the client could mitigate this risk. And so we came up with two buckets of recommendations. First, I just want to say that these are draft recommendations. We're still working with the client to finalize this. But the two buckets are using policy and using proactive efforts to kind of accentuate and those policy recommendations. So in terms of mitigating displacement, we recommended that the Community Redevelopment Agency, which Catherine spoke to, and the state really lean into preserving affordable housing in different ways. So try to find a way to make investments in affordable housing, make sure that existing folks living in those types of housing communities have the ability to maintain their existing housing. With respect to mitigating cultural change and lost history, we recommended the creation of cultural acknowledgements, funding for art spaces, community spaces, and historic preservation. And the proactive efforts are really, like I said, trying to accentuate those other recommendations where the city and county can partner with faith-based organizations to also invest in affordable housing and think about engaging with affordable housing developers in the state. And so now we just wanted to take some time to reflect on what this project kind of means for our work as practitioners. So some highlights that came to mind as we were thinking through this work is the need to really consider shifting social, economic, and demographic changes and understanding the underlying motivations and causes of these changes in our work. And this, I think, goes beyond just, climate change. It's, thinking about transportation planning and other types of planning efforts. In light of climate change, we found it to be really useful and something we're trying to apply in our work more broadly is thinking about both the direct and indirect impacts to vulnerable populations. So, there's a lot of work in the area of understanding who will be flooded, who will be impacted by wildfires, but it's thinking about the downstream effects of if there's flooding, if there are wildfires, what happens to folks, and what are those kind of potential risks and how do we analyze them, like gentrification. And then, as Catherine already mentioned, the need to really think about the unintended consequences of our work. So, part of this project was suggesting investments, and then also, a recommendation of this project was investing in affordable housing and making sure that the folks who live there can stay. And so trying to bring that kind of holistic approach and that really human approach to the work that we do. Pass it off to Catherine.
Thank you, Allie. So we think about why we are having this conversation, and so glad everyone can join us today. We aim to address the unintended consequences as we plan for the future, be it for climate impacts, or we're planning to accommodate the needs for future transportation planning. The way we should be looking at this is one, acknowledging that there is a challenge, and then tackling the inequities head on. Right? When we look at a project, a transportation project, let's say, who are impacted disproportionately? It doesn't come intuitively or it's not embedded in our planning processes. We do need to acknowledge that any and every decision we make today has the potential to create impacts for the future, and that could disproportionately impact certain populations. And as practitioners, what can we do to shift that trajectory? It's, again, not in our standard practice, but what can we do? How can we empower ourselves and others in our team to look at these solutions differently? And lastly, we want to leave you with what can we do within our communities to change the paradigm of how we make these decisions today, so we consider these unintended consequences to these disproportionately impacted communities. So yeah, with that, we would love to hear from you and questions you may have.
Yeah, thanks, Catherine. Yeah, as a reminder, feel free to put questions in the question box, and the presentation itself will be in the handout box. And it looks like we have a little over 10 minutes for Q&A. So to kick things off, Catherine, I guess our first question is, if money were not an issue, what approach and methodology would you have applied on this project?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And most of our scope is so restricted to available funding. We were very privileged to have a client that acknowledged that, one, that climate gentrification is an issue, because it was a trend that they were already seeing from current market conditions, right? So they did allocate some funding for us to study the future impacts. However, that pot was rather slim. So if we do have, if the money were no object, and we had agencies who wanted to dig in a little bit more, in the Jackson Street project, what I would have loved to do is sit down with these nonprofits and the agencies and come up with a roadmap. Now we have recommendations, but like what concrete next steps, exactly which lots could be developed to what, to ensure we have those protections, affordable housings in place for the future. Also, it would be awesome if we could have had a couple of workshops with our agency partners who want to make these changes. And there are other communities who are going through these, and everyone's learning at the same time. An exchange of ideas and lessons learned would have been a very useful thing to have had. Allie, if you want to add to that.
Yeah, no, I think those are great points. I think for me, what comes to mind is having different data sets. So thinking about future demographics data sets, we relied on a lot of historical data. I think it would have been helpful to kind of make the case for these changes. And also, on top of workshops with the client and community nonprofits, like I, love to dig into this more with community members in like terms of developing that roadmap, and just have an open conversation about ideas about how to make their community the way they want it to look and feel. And I think to some extent, Catherine, you also kind of touched on a question that we got about how do you convince a municipality that this potential issue is worth investing in terms of a study and management. So it sounds like you talked a little bit about like seeing these trends already as a motivation. Is there anything else you'd say?
Yeah, absolutely. So the CRA, or the Community Redevelopment Agency, was a huge partner in this discussion. And they have, that team has been working with the community to put these checks and balances. And over the last 10 years, especially, and during COVID, there was a big trend, the real estate trend, which really started pushing people out of affordable solutions. So they were very aware, hyper aware of that change in demographics. That helped when we talked about, hey, look at future trends, this could happen. And it seemed that they were open to looking at that. Additionally, I want to also mention that within the scope of this project, we were allowed to look at a quantitative analysis of market trends. Not just look at it qualitatively and of just hearsay. We were able to do this quantitative study to see what the changes are from the future, the historical trends, And with that, we were able to also project, I didn't spend too much time in that, but just looking at the next 10 years, what the market would look like. So that helped with formulating some of these policies.
Yeah, that's a great point. And also just say to that question about convincing folks is, I think we've seen more and more receptibility to different perspectives in, maybe projects that are specifically looking at transportation or specifically looking at one type of infrastructure with respect to climate. But to kind of share the knowledge of a lot of the folks who work in equity related work in the US, it's, just present the idea, just see if folks think it's interesting, think it's relevant. And I think it's always important to just bring up things that you find important to that community, and see if folks are receptive to it. It's always, a journey and many steps down the road. It's not all at once. So I think that's always kind of helpful to remind yourself of if you're thinking about bringing up something new. Let's see. We have a question about, can you explain how affordable housing will change and help climate gentrification? Can try to start answering that one. I think, our perspective was really along the lines of how a lot of these trends are trends that we really can no longer stop with respect to climate change. I think, there's a certain amount of change built in. And so obviously we want to do the work of mitigating emissions and reducing these impacts, and planning effectively, but trying to be as pragmatic about kind of what's happening as possible. So we saw preserving affordable housing as a way for residents who currently live on the corridor to continue to be able to live there, and not be displaced if we continue to see the trends of property prices increasing, and the other demographic changes we were seeing based on the analysis. So we saw it as a way for folks to remain in place in their community and alleviate that financial stress.
Right, and some of these solutions are very similar to any displacement solutions. They're not so different. We just want to have checks and balances in place. If a family chose to live in the same home as their grandparents did, that there was an opportunity for that to happen.
Yeah. Another question we have is, have you studied the impacts on the displaced people from gentrification? If areas which are more protected against climate change are being gentrified, do the displaced people get forced to go to locations which are more likely to be impacted by climate change? Very, very good question and very relevant. I'll start by just saying the first thing that comes to mind is that one, I have not done that work in terms of kind of what that looks like in a project context, but there is definitely a lot of great academic literature in this space where folks have done longer studies. The study that comes to mind is a recently released publication by Miyuki Hino, and it was looking at the North Carolina context in the US about flood controls and kind of if we're limiting development in high flood risk areas, what does that mean for populations? And I think the kind of general synopsis is that we weren't actually seeing folks getting out of high risk areas. You're seeing folks moving to other risky areas. So I think there's a lot of great work in that space that accentuates the fact that there are these concerns about the downstream effects of some of these policies for very vulnerable populations. Would you like to add anything to that, Catherine?
You got that, Allie.
Okay.
I see a question on spatial design. So a question is how can we incorporate microclimate correlation with spatial design? It sounds like this question is similar maybe to what we started doing on Jackson Street, even though we didn't look at climate as a focus area. So I'm assuming when you say spatial design, this is like through a GIS overlay study. So what we did with Jackson Street is we overlaid what we saw as future storm surge impacted areas and see where that sits in terms of socioeconomic, right? So it was very clear the areas which were impacted are the areas which are higher income. So then it was very clear that that community is going to go elsewhere and in that process displace other populations. So that's how we did it on Jackson Street. So I think there is opportunity to look at when we look at climate trends, climate futures, to look at not just what happens within the impacted area, but what that cascading effect is within the adjacent community, which may be the receiving areas for displacement. Allie, if you want to add to that.
You covered it. I think we've answered some of the other questions too through these answers.
So another one, are you seeing a need or interest for this type of analyses outside of Florida?
Yeah, definitely seeing a need. I think, being in the California context, there's a lot of considerations around wildfire displacement and heat, and also if you're going to be relocating folks from rural areas, what that means for kind of general population needs. So definitely see a need. How about you, Catherine?
No, absolutely. It is absolutely a need. The conditions in Florida are sort of unique, but that translates as something different in other parts of the country, for sure. It's just very unique that in Florida, the lower lying area just happened to be the waterfront area, which happened to be where the higher, more expensive properties lie. And it just so happens that the higher ground is where in the past areas were allocated for certain populations. So I'm sure you talked about California and other areas. It might be similar pressures from climate on communities which have been disenfranchised and disinvested in the past.
Yeah, definitely. I think there's also, depending on everyone's kind of local context, there's like entryways to seeing this need. I think from California, it's specifically housing. It's thinking about, housing affordability is already a huge challenge. And so we definitely see folks curious about how, if we're working on a transportation project, how that connects to the housing affordability piece and kind of how housing be impacted, because if there are large areas of housing that are going to be impacted long term, that has cascading effects for long-term affordability when it's already very challenging for folks. So I think there are definitely different entryways to this, and be very curious. And maybe this is a segue to concluding, since we're at 8:45 Pacific time, where we definitely welcome folks to reach out. We definitely welcome folks to ask us questions, send us an email, give us a call, but also would love to hear kind of what you're seeing in your communities globally. So if you're seeing these trends, definitely think there's a lot of great knowledge sharing that could happen across the WSP network and beyond as well. So yeah, I guess thank you all for joining, and definitely welcome you all to reach out to Catherine and myself.
Thank you.